I never imagined a quiet little neighborhood could hide so much drama. I moved here expecting picket fences, polite waves from neighbors, and the occasional hi at the mailbox. Instead, I found myself living next to Karen. You know the type, the self-appointed HOA president who treats every blade of grass, mailbox, and hanging plant like it's a matter of national security. She could spot a crooked flower pot from a mile away and would probably fine you for breathing too loudly. But I wasn't here to battle Karen yet. I was here for peace, or so I thought. One afternoon, I was driving down the road that ran past her pristine little enclave, the kind of street that makes you feel like you're in a Hallmark movie, when I noticed a for sale sign on the edge of the lake next to her HOA. My heart skipped a beat. The lake, quiet, untouched, and just far enough from my own backyard that it felt like a secret waiting to be discovered. I slowed the car and stared at it. There was something about the way the sunlight danced across the water, the ducks lazily paddling near the reeds, that whispered opportunity in my ear. And then it hit me, I could buy it. I'm not a gambler, but I've always liked the idea of making bold moves. I called the number on the sign immediately, expecting the usual sorry, already sold, or we'll call you back. But no, the owner picked up, and after a surprisingly friendly conversation, I found myself scheduling a visit. I imagined my new weekend escape, a canoe on the lake, maybe a small dock, just the sound of water and the wind through the trees. I could even invite friends over for a summer barbecue. The possibilities felt endless. I didn't know it yet, but Karen had already spotted the for sale sign too. The next morning, as I drove by the lake again, I noticed her. Standing at the edge of her perfectly manicured lawn, she was staring at the water like it was the source of all evil in the world. I swear I could see smoke coming out of her ears. She had that tight-lipped, wide-eyed look, half disbelief, half rage. And for a moment, I realized I was dealing with someone who treated property lines like sacred battlefields. I tried to ignore it, but I could feel her energy radiating toward me. It was the kind of glare that makes you question your entire life decisions. I parked near the lake and took a small walk along the shore, imagining what it would be like to own it. And then, as if the universe had a sense of humor, Karen's car pulled up. She stepped out in that typical HOA armor, sunglasses, pearls, and an expression that said, "I am about to ruin your life, gently but decisively." She didn't approach immediately, just stood there, arms crossed, staring. It was like watching a wild animal assessing its prey. I waved politely because I didn't want to start a war yet, but I could feel the tension thickening in the air. Something told me she wasn't going to take this lightly. I went back home, heart racing but grinning. There's a certain thrill in knowing you've just poked the hornet's nest, and Karen was the biggest hornet of them all. I opened my laptop and started looking at the paperwork, making sure everything was in order. I double-checked the boundaries, the deed, the access rights, every little detail. I wasn't about to give her a legitimate reason to start a fight. By the end of the day, I had signed the papers. The lake was officially mine. And that's when I realized it wasn't just a piece of property anymore. It was a battlefield. From the moment I closed the deal, I knew things would never be the same. Karen would be watching, plotting, and probably drafting an HOA newsletter titled something like "Beware, the Lake Invader." But for now, I had a secret smile, knowing I held the first card. Little did I know, Karen's obsession with control would escalate faster than I ever imagined, and my quiet little dream of owning a lake was about to turn into a full-blown neighborhood drama. I woke up the next morning with a sense of triumph. The lake was officially mine. I imagined paddling a canoe, casting a line, maybe even setting up a small fire pit on the shore. Peace, solitude, and a little slice of freedom. What I didn't realize was that this slice of freedom had an owner who was far from peaceful. Karen noticed. I first saw it from my kitchen window. She was standing on the edge of her immaculate lawn, binoculars in hand, because of course she had binoculars, staring at the lake as if it had personally offended her. Her posture was rigid, shoulders tense, lips pressed in that tight, controlling line she always wore when plotting something. I could feel her scheming from across the street, a tangible weight pressing down like a storm about to break. By mid-morning, things escalated. I found an envelope on my front porch, stamped with the HOA logo in bold letters. My heart sank as I tore it open. Inside were pages and pages of what can only be described as Karen's rules for life and property management, accompanied by stern warnings about trespassing, illegal encroachment, and my personal favorite, moral obligations to the HOA community. Apparently, owning the lake came with responsibilities I hadn't signed up for, like making sure the ducks were properly registered or that the water sparkled according to HOA standards. I laughed out loud. Of course, that probably made it worse, because Karen's face appeared in my mind in full, furious glory, eyes bulging behind her sunglasses, hand shaking with righteous anger. I could almost hear her shouting into her phone, calling the board, demanding emergency meetings, and drafting scathing emails about neighbors who think rules don't apply to them. I decided to be cautious at first. I walked down to the lake to inspect it, hoping to enjoy the serenity before Karen's full-scale storm hit. That's when I noticed her driving slowly past the street several times, glancing over at the water with a look that could curdle milk. I waved politely, trying to appear innocent. Big mistake, she waved back, sort of. Her fingers jutted out in a rigid salute as if she were declaring war without saying a word. The first confrontation was inevitable. Karen knocked on my door just as I was about to call a contractor to fix the dock. She carried a stack of HOA documents so thick it could have doubled as a small coffee table. "I'm here to discuss your illegal actions regarding community property," she announced, breathless from the dramatic sprint up my walkway. "Community property?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Karen, I bought this lake legally. The deed, the sale, everything's official." Her eyes narrowed to slits. "Legal or not, this lake has been part of our community for decades. You don't just waltz in and claim it as your own." I could feel the neighbors watching. From across the street, old Mr. Thompson peered over his hedge, and I swear Mrs. Ramirez held her hand to her mouth to stifle a laugh. Karen had a flair for drama, and this was peak performance. The encounter ended with Karen storming off, muttering something about calling the HOA board and contacting a lake rights attorney. I leaned against my door frame, shaking my head, half in disbelief and half in amusement. This was only day one of owning the lake. I hadn't even placed the dock yet, and Karen was already spiraling. By evening, I found more hints of her brewing plan. Flyers had been distributed around the neighborhood with passive-aggressive messages about respecting HOA property. Emails landed in inboxes warning of new lake ownership violations. And of course, Karen herself was in constant motion, patrolling, peering, writing notes in a tiny notebook she probably kept just for tracking neighborhood infractions. That's when it hit me. Owning this lake wasn't just about the water. It was about stepping into a battlefield, and Karen was armed to the teeth with rules, drama, and an endless sense of self-importance. But something else stirred inside me too, a quiet thrill. I had legally purchased the lake, and now I had the upper hand. Karen might be loud, dramatic, and obsessive, but she didn't own the law, and she certainly didn't own my patience. As I walked along the lake that evening, watching the sunset reflect off the water, I felt a strange mix of excitement and dread. Karen's obsession was a storm on the horizon, and I was standing right in its path. The only question was, how long could I enjoy this peace before the first full-scale attack began? Little did I know that storm was closer than I thought. I should have seen it coming, I really should have. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the full force of Karen unleashed. It was a Saturday morning, the kind where the sun feels warm on your face and everything seems peaceful. I was sipping coffee on my porch, enjoying the new view of the lake glinting in the early light, when I heard the unmistakable crunch of perfectly manicured shoes on gravel. I looked up. There she was, Karen, and she was not happy. She came barreling down my driveway, waving a thick stack of papers like a flag in a battle. Her sunglasses glinted in the sun, hiding eyes that were, I was pretty sure, shooting literal fire. "We need to talk," she barked before I could even say hello. I set down my coffee, keeping my tone calm. "Morning, Karen, I assume this is about the lake." Her face contorted into a mix of fury and disbelief. About the lake, this is about respect, morality, community integrity." I blinked. "Community integrity?" I asked slowly, trying not to laugh. "Karen, I bought the lake, the deed is in my name, legally this is my property." She waved the papers again, nearly sending a couple into the air. "Legally, yes, but morally, absolutely not. You cannot just insert yourself into our neighborhood like this." I realized I was facing a full-blown theatrical performance. She stomped her foot, swung her arm dramatically toward the water, and made a sound that can only be described as a cross between a gasp and a squeal. "How dare you?" she shouted. "This lake has been part of this community's history for decades, and now you claim it for yourself." Humor bubbled up despite my best efforts to stay composed. I tried to picture her speech from the perspective of a Shakespearean villain, which frankly made the whole scene slightly more bearable. "Karen," I said carefully, "I don't want to fight, I just want to enjoy the lake." Her eyes widened in what I can only call scandalized horror. Enjoy? How can you enjoy something that belongs to all of us? I've never seen such selfishness." At this point, the neighbors had begun to gather. Mr. Thompson was peeking over his hedge, holding his morning newspaper like a shield, and Mrs. Ramirez had her hands clasped to her mouth, whispering something about the drama. I realized Karen didn't just act like she ran the neighborhood, she performed like she owned the entire moral compass of it. The situation escalated quickly. She started packing back and forth, muttering about legal action, petitions, informing the HOA board, and the utterly absurd threat of a community boycott of the lake. I nodded politely, trying not to let my amusement show. Each word that came out of her mouth sounded like another brick in a wall of pure chaos. Finally, she paused and pointed directly at me, finger quivering like a lightning rod. "I swear, if you don't undo this, I will see to it that you regret it every single day." I realized then that trying to reason with her was futile. Karen had reached peak meltdown. I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice. I just smiled and said calmly, "Well, I guess we'll just have to see how this plays out." That seemed to infuriate her further. She turned on her heel, flapping her papers, and marched back to her car like she was leading an army retreat. I watched her go, the papers spilling slightly in the wind, and I couldn't help but feel a small, quiet thrill. Karen had no idea that this lake wasn't just a weekend escape, it was my stage now too. As the sun climbed higher, I walked down to the lake, checking the boundaries, imagining where the dock would go. Every rustle in the reeds, every splash of a fish, felt like a reminder that this was mine. And every glance back at Karen's HOA compound, with her suspiciously glaring from her window, reminded me that the real battle had only just begun. Because if Saturday had taught me anything, it was this: Karen wasn't just dramatic, she was relentless. And if I wanted to enjoy this lake, I would have to be smarter, calmer, and perhaps a little mischievous. Little did I know, she was already planning her next move. And trust me, whatever she had in mind was going to make Saturday morning look like a quiet Sunday stroll. After Karen's Saturday meltdown, I spent the next few days in a mix of exhilaration and disbelief. Every time I looked at the lake, I could practically feel her glare slicing across the water from her perfectly trimmed lawn. I knew that owning the lake had triggered something primal in her, a need to control, to dominate, to enforce HOA morality at all costs. But here's the thing, I wasn't scared, not really. In fact, the more I thought about Karen, the more I realized that her obsession with control could actually work in my favor. She was predictable, obsessive, and hilariously over the top. If I played this right, I could turn her own energy against her. I started making a plan, not a reckless, let's annoy Karen for fun kind of plan, but a careful, strategic move designed to assert my rights and, yes, teach her a lesson in humility. I spent hours walking the lake's perimeter, measuring distances, marking property lines, and imagining exactly where a fence would go. It had to be precise, every post perfectly aligned, legally sound, but unavoidable for her to ignore. Humor helped me keep my sanity. I imagined her reaction to each step. Would she scream, write letters, maybe start a petition called "Save the HOA from the Lake Invader"? The mental image of her flailing arms and dramatic gasps made me snicker quietly to myself as I paced the property. I also researched. Hours on legal sites, HOA regulations, and property rights made me feel like a tiny warrior, preparing for a battle I was determined to win. Every time I found a loophole or a supportive statute, my confidence grew. Karen could yell, wave papers, and stomp her foot, but she couldn't override the law, not if I was careful. Neighbors began noticing my presence at the lake more often. Some waved cautiously, others whispered excitedly about the unfolding drama. I didn't care about gossip, Karen had already made herself the talk of the neighborhood, but I did take notes on who might support me if things escalated. A quiet alliance with a few observant neighbors might be useful when the time came to assert my property rights in plain sight. The suspense in the air was almost tangible. Every glance from Karen's window, every suspicious car slowly driving past my property made me feel like I was in the eye of a storm. But instead of panicking, I channeled that tension into planning. I visualized the fence going up, post by post, slicing across the property line in a way that would be legal but undeniable. It was bold, audacious, and I realized exactly the kind of thing that would drive Karen completely bonkers. Humorously, I even considered a few over-the-top ideas before settling on the fence. Floating signs, too silly; a moat, too messy; laser pointers aimed at her window, tempting but probably illegal. No, a fence was perfect. Solid, visible, immovable, every inch of it a statement, this is mine. The real trick, though, was timing. Karen was already twitchy, checking the lake multiple times a day. If I started too soon, she might intervene prematurely. If I waited too long, the suspense might fizzle. I decided on early next week, after she'd spend a weekend simmering in frustration and just before she could rally the HOA board into action. As I finished my final walk around the lake that evening, the sun dipping low over the water, I felt a mix of anticipation and giddy excitement. This wasn't just about property, it was about asserting control in a way she couldn't touch. I wasn't going to stoop to petty HOA tricks. I was going to operate above them, calm, precise, and unshakable. And Karen, I knew, was going to lose her mind. Because she had no idea that I had a plan, a real plan. And when I finally put it into motion, the lake wouldn't just be mine, it would be my stage. Every post, every foot of fence would be a quiet, undeniable statement. The lake, the land, and yes, even the drama were now under my control. I went to bed that night imagining her morning face, waiting for the next chapter of our little war to unfold. Little did I know, the moment I had been waiting for was already just days away. The day had finally arrived. Contractors, tools, and rolls of fencing were lined up along the lake's edge, and I could feel my heart pounding not from fear but from anticipation. Today, Karen would see that I wasn't bluffing. The lake was mine and the fence was going up. I tried to keep it casual, standing back with a cup of coffee, watching the crew work. Posts went into the ground one by one, each perfectly spaced, straight as an arrow. It was oddly satisfying seeing the fence slowly take shape, a physical manifestation of boundaries and ownership. But I didn't have to wait long for the fireworks. Karen appeared almost immediately. I swear she materialized out of nowhere like some kind of HOA vigilante. Sunglasses perched on her nose, pearls gleaming in the sun, papers clutched in her hand like they were weapons of mass destruction. She didn't even knock. She just marched up to me, the ultimate display of fury in motion. "What is this?" she demanded, voice rising with each word. "You can't just put a fence here, this is community property. Think of the children, the ducks, the HOA guidelines." I took a slow sip of my coffee, pretending to consider her argument. "Karen," I said evenly, "I bought the lake. Legally, every post we're putting up is on my property." Her jaw practically hit the ground. "Legally?" she echoed, her voice like a car alarm. "Legal doesn't mean moral, you can't just fence off our lake." Humor bubbled up inside me as she flailed her arms dramatically, pointing at the posts as if they had personally insulted her. One post leaned slightly to the side from the angle of the ground, nothing serious, but she gasped like it was a national emergency. I nearly laughed out loud, trying to imagine the newsletter she'd draft tonight. "Lake Invader uses fence to oppress HOA residents." The neighbors were out in full force by this point, whispering, peeking over hedges, and even waving in encouragement. Some seemed fascinated by the unfolding chaos. I could feel the tension thickening, and I knew this was exactly the moment Karen thrived on. She loved drama, but she also hated losing control. By mid-morning, the fence was halfway done. I stepped back to admire the clean lines, the way it cut through the property as if to say, "This is mine, deal with it." And that's when she tried escalation number one, the phone call. Karen whipped out her cell, muttering into it like she was dialing the HOA command center. She shouted about illegal encroachment and imminent community threats, and I realized with quiet amusement that she hadn't even read the deed. Every single boundary had been double-checked, surveyed, and legally documented. She was storming into battle armed with nothing but paperwork and self-righteous fury. That didn't stop her from trying. Karen started packing along the fence line, reading off rules from her thick binder, pointing at posts, and declaring them violations of some law she clearly invented. "Section 5, subsection 12, you're in violation," she yelled, waving a finger at me like it had the power to stop the installation. I stayed calm, knowing the legal truth, and also because watching Karen lose it was strangely entertaining. I had my boundaries, my property rights, and my patience. She had passion, paranoia, and a dramatic flair for destruction, but no leverage. By early afternoon, the fence was nearly complete. Karen, realizing her words were powerless, resorted to theatrics. Fainting onto a folding chair she had apparently carried for dramatic effect, gasping for community justice, and threatening to contact the authorities if we dared touch one more post. The neighbors, now fully invested, watched silently as I poured coffee into my thermos and gestured at the crew to continue. Every post went up without incident. Every nail hammered was a quiet statement. This lake wasn't just mine, it was untouchable. And all the while, Karen's shrill voice echoed across the water, a soundtrack to my victory in progress. By sunset, the fence was fully installed, standing tall and undeniable, slicing through the property line in a perfect display of legal and aesthetic precision. I stepped back, taking it all in, the calm water behind it, the neat line of posts, and the simmering fury on Karen's face as she finally realized she couldn't stop it. It wasn't just a fence, it was a statement. And Karen was already plotting her next moves. The morning after the fence went up, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and anticipation. Satisfaction because the posts were in place, standing tall, perfectly aligned, a monument to my property rights. Anticipation because I knew Karen wouldn't take this lying down. She was already brewing in the background like a storm ready to erupt. And erupt she did. I was enjoying a quiet coffee on the porch when I heard the unmistakable sound of tires screeching. Karen had arrived in her minivan, slamming the door so hard the whole neighborhood probably heard it. She stormed up the driveway with papers spilling from her hands, muttering threats that grew louder with every step. "You think a fence changes anything?" she shouted, voice rising like an opera singer hitting the high note. "I'm calling the HOA, I'm calling lawyers, I'm calling everyone." I tried not to grin. Her over-the-top theatrics were actually entertaining at this point. She flailed her arms like she was orchestrating an invisible orchestra, each gesture more dramatic than the last. The neighbors were out again, peeking over fences, some whispering, some barely holding back laughter. I swear Mr. Thompson had a pair of binoculars trained on Karen's every move, probably taking mental notes for his book on neighborhood absurdities. Karen's first attempt at escalation was the lawyer call. She waved her phone in my face like it was a sword. "I've got a lawyer on speed dial, they'll have this fence down by noon." I calmly took a sip of coffee, letting her voice wash over me. "Karen," I said evenly, "you can call all the lawyers you want. The fence is on my property, every post, every boundary, every inch, it's all legal. You can yell, threaten, and wave papers, but it won't change that." Her jaw literally dropped. I could see the wheels turning in her head, trying to reconcile her sense of moral superiority with actual property law. That's when she went full meltdown. She began packing in front of the fence, muttering about moral obligations, community betrayal, and for some reason, the honor of the HOA ancestors. Then she did something I didn't think possible. She fainted. Well, sort of. She collapsed dramatically onto a folding chair she had brought, hands clutching at invisible chest pain, as if the sight of my fence had physically wounded her. Neighbors couldn't help but stare. Some hid behind hedges, trying not to laugh, while others whispered encouragement. I stayed seated, sipping coffee, watching Karen perform her one-woman show of outrage. But she wasn't done. Oh no, she escalated further. She pulled out a bullhorn, yes, a bullhorn. She started broadcasting her grievances across the neighborhood. "This fence is illegal, we will not be silenced. The lake belongs to the community." I resisted the urge to clap. This was peak Karen, theatrics, paranoia, and misplaced authority all rolled into one fiery package. But I knew something she didn't. I had checked every legal boundary, every survey, every HOA clause. Her bullhorn couldn't undo the law. By mid-afternoon, she had moved on to dramatic phone calls with neighbors, rallying anyone who would listen. She threatened petitions, lawsuits, and even a community protest by the fountain in front of her HOA office. Yet every step she took only reinforced the fence's permanence. Every flailing hand, every shrill shout made it clear she had no power over the reality in front of her. I began to realize something funny. Her chaos was predictable, and predictable chaos is something you can plan for. I smiled quietly as I watched her spiral further, thinking ahead to the next moves I could make. Karen had underestimated me. She thought she could intimidate me with theatrics, but I had patience, legality, and strategic planning on my side. By sunset, she finally retreated, still muttering, still plotting, still furious, but no fence post had moved. I poured myself a glass of iced tea, walked down to the water's edge, and admired the scene. The fence stood tall, the lake sparkled in the fatting sun, and Karen's fury floated across the neighborhood like a storm cloud that couldn't touch me. One thing was certain, the battle wasn't over. Karen had hit peak chaos and I had survived it, but the next act in this drama would require even more creativity, more patience, and yes, a little playful mischief. Because owning the lake wasn't just about property anymore. It was about showing Karen and the entire neighborhood that patience and strategy could triumph over pure, unrestrained rage. And I was ready for her next move. By now, Karen's rage had reached a level I didn't think possible. I'd seen her packing, yelling, fainting, and even attempting dramatic phone calls as if the universe itself should intervene on her behalf. And yet, despite her chaos, the fence stood, my lake stood, and slowly I began to realize something delicious. Owning the lake gave me powers she never anticipated. It started with the legal details. Property lines, water rights, and access laws, things Karen had clearly never bothered to learn, were suddenly my shield. The lake wasn't just a weekend retreat anymore, it was my fortress. Every inch I had bought was undeniable, documented, and untouchable. Karen's threats, petitions, and theatrics couldn't override that. The thrill came when I realized how much subtle mischief I could get away with. I began small. A decorative sign near the fence that read, innocuously, "Private Lake, please respect boundaries." It was technically harmless, but I could see Karen from her window, twitching, glaring, muttering, and probably rewriting HOA rules in her head just to cope. Neighbors began noticing, too. Some whispered encouragement, others chuckled quietly, seeing Karen's escalating panic. I watched her try to rally support, trying to frame my actions as some kind of community betrayal, but she couldn't produce a single law that justified removing the fence. Every claim, every outburst was dismissed by the clear reality: the lake was mine. And that's when I decided to lean into it a little more. One morning, I arrived with a kayak and quietly paddled near the fence line that bordered her backyard, just far enough to be visible from her window, just close enough that she could see me enjoying my property. Karen appeared instantly, running outside, waving her arms like a traffic cop gone rogue. I smiled, waved back, and took a leisurely sip of my thermos coffee. Her shriek carried across the neighborhood like an alarm bell, and I felt a twinge of satisfaction. It wasn't cruel, it was justice. The next level came when I organized a small, private gathering on my side of the lake. Friends quietly floated in canoes, laughed, and enjoyed the water, all while Karen's attention was drawn inescapably to the fence line. She fumed, she shouted, she probably drafted an emergency HOA newsletter right there on her laptop. Meanwhile, I remained calm, sitting on the dock, watching the sunset and savoring the irony. Humor aside, the lake's legal advantage gave me confidence. I began considering future projects: a small dock extension, a fishing platform, maybe even a floating garden. Everything was within my rights, and every small addition was another reminder that Karen's control over the neighborhood was, in reality, quite limited. By midweek, Karen had exhausted most of her initial tricks. Phone calls, emails, dramatic fainting, nothing had worked. She had no legal foothold. She had no allies willing to risk their own property rights, and she certainly didn't have the patience to outlast me. Her desperation became almost comical. One afternoon, I saw her peering over the fence with a pair of binoculars, muttering about planning violations and community ethics, scribbling furiously in a notebook that probably cataloged my every move since day one. I waved. She recoiled as if I had just committed a crime. The suspense of this moment was intoxicating. Karen believed she still had a chance to win, yet every action she took only underscored her defeat, and I knew the final blow, the ultimate demonstration of control, was coming. All it required was patience, strategy, and the quiet enjoyment of a lake she would never own. By evening, the water reflected the golden sunset, the fence stood unwavering, and Karen's fury simmered in the background. I could feel it, a constant tension in the neighborhood, but this tension was now mine to orchestrate. I had turned the lake into more than a property. It was my advantage, my shield, and my stage. And Karen, she was trapped in her own obsession, powerless to do anything except rage, plot, and slowly realize she couldn't win. Little did she know, the best part of this story was yet to come. By the time the final weekend rolled around, I knew Karen had run out of tricks. She had staged fainting episodes, shouted at neighbors, drafted multiple newsletters, and called at least 3 lawyers who promptly told her what I already knew. The fence was legally mine and the lake belonged to me. The suspense was almost unbearable for her, certainly, but for me, it was sweet anticipation. Saturday morning began like any other. I arrived at the lake with my coffee, a small cooler, and the satisfaction of knowing I had won. The fence stood tall, the lake sparkled, and for the first time I felt like I was truly in control of my property. Karen, as expected, appeared moments later, standing on her perfectly manicured lawn, clutching a new stack of papers, her face a mixture of fury, disbelief, and exhaustion. "You think this changes anything?" she shrieked, packing back and forth. "I will not allow this, you're destroying the community, the community." I watched her theatrics for a few moments, taking a slow sip of coffee. Then calmly I said, "Karen, the community is fine. You, however, might want to sit down. This lake is mine, the fence is legal, and your threats are ineffective." Her jaw literally dropped. I could see the realization hit her in waves, first denial, then panic, then full-blown horror as it dawned on her. She had been outmaneuvered. But Karen being Karen, she couldn't just accept defeat gracefully. Oh no, she tried one last desperate act. She stormed to the corner of the fence, attempting to remove a post, muttering about illegal obstruction and moral violations. I stepped outside and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Karen," I said softly, almost kindly, "every post is on my property. You can scream, cry, and flail, but nothing here belongs to the HOA, not the fence, not the lake, not even the drama." Her face turned an alarming shade of crimson, and for a brief moment I thought she might combust from sheer frustration. But then she did something unexpected. She stopped, stared, and slowly, ever so slowly, she turned and retreated back to her house, muttering incoherently under her breath, "Victory." The neighbors, who had been watching from a safe distance, began clapping quietly, some discreetly, some with obvious glee. I waved, feeling a strange sense of camaraderie. It wasn't just about the lake or the fence. It was about proving that patience, strategy, and a little humor could triumph over even the most obsessive HOA tyrant. With Karen finally removed from the immediate chaos, I spent the afternoon enjoying the lake for the first time without interruptions. Canoe paddles sliced through calm water, the dock gleamed in the sunlight, and laughter echoed across the shoreline as friends joined me for a quiet, peaceful gathering. The suspense of what Karen might do next had evaporated, replaced by a simple, satisfying reality: I had won. Humor, of course, still lingered in the background. I couldn't resist adding a few playful touches, a small floating sign near the fence visible from her window that read, "Lake owner at work, please mind your drama." It was subtle, legal, and infuriatingly effective. From my perch on the dock, I could see Karen glancing nervously in my direction, fists clenched, probably plotting another newsletter she would never send. By evening, the lake reflected the orange and pink hues of sunset. The fence stood firm, and Karen's fury had finally turned to exhaustion. She could rant all she wanted, but nothing she did could undo what had been done. My victory was quiet, firm, and undeniably mine. And that, I realized, was the moral of the story. Sometimes patience, strategy, and a little boldness can triumph over drama, chaos, and obsessive control. You don't have to fight fire with fire, you just have to know where the boundaries are, literally. As I watched the last light fade over the water, I took a deep breath, smiling. The lake was mine, the fence was mine. And Karen, well, she was still Karen, just now powerless to interfere. And in that moment, with the water calm, the post straight, and the neighborhood finally quiet, I realized something important. The best revenge, the sweetest victory, is the one where you don't stoop to chaos. You simply stand firm, enjoy what's yours, and let the other person's drama burn itself out. The lake, the fence, the freedom, it was all mine. And for the first time since I bought it, I felt completely at peace. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.